Hey there guys, on today's skill issue guide I wanted to take a look at a vehicle from the latest update which probably received the least amount of fanfare of any of the new top tier aircraft, the J-11B, also known as the Dragon Flanker. This is the first Chinese flanker variant we've received that isn't just mostly a copy-paste of a Russian version, being equipped instead with an entirely domestic missile loadout, and it has two things that it's particularly notable for. The first is that it actually gets better engines than the Su-30SM despite being at a lower BR rung, meaning it gets to bully all the new FA-18C early pilots, and it gets a new missile, the PL-8B, which arguably is the best overall IR missile in the game right now. I'll talk more about that thing when I get to weaponry, but first I'd like to address the elephant in the room, which is why the hell is this thing at a lower BR than the Su-30SM if it has better flight performance? Well, the first reason is the radar. It's certainly not as terrible as some other top tier aircraft, but compared to the Su-30SM or something like the Rafale, it's not really quite up to scratch. There's also the fact that this aircraft doesn't get thrust vectoring, though it does get a MAWS system, which is nice. And by the way, if you have this aircraft or any other with a missile approach warning system, there's been a change to the default settings for this system. You're going to want to go into the options menu, go to air battle settings, and disable automatic countermeasures release at mission start. If you don't do this, you'll have to automatically deactivate it at the start of every match, which is unbelievably annoying. Anyways, the other issue is your BVR missiles, or lack thereof. This aircraft only gets 6 Fox 3s, significantly less than the 8, 10, or even 12 found on other top tier aircraft, as well as the fact that these are PL-12s, and if you're not familiar with the PL-12 in War Thunder, it has something interesting going on with it. The PL-12 in real life is a very large, very modern active radar homing missile that is about 30% larger than the AMRAAM and with more raw acceleration. However, in War Thunder, despite all this being modeled, it still only has about 2/3 the effective range of the AMRAAM. So I'm sure you're all wondering, how the hell is it possible for a larger missile with more thrust relative to its size to have less range? I mean, the R-77 makes sense because it has those sewer grate fins on the back, but the PL-12 is clearly very aerodynamic. Well, it all comes down to something Gaijin likes to rather questionably call game balance. You see, when they made the decision to add Fox 3s to the game, they felt the need to just shoehorn this thing in alongside early AMRAAMs and R-77s, rather than just giving China a Taiwanese AMRAAM carrier or something, alongside the J-11A. And to quote-unquote balance the PL-12, they just stuck it with an enormous artificial drag nerf. I mean, we have the Iranian F-14 at 13.0 with 4 fucker 90s, so I'm pretty sure 2 unnerfed PL-12s on the J-8 at 13.0, or 6 on the J-10 and J-11 if they got moved up to 14.0, wouldn't be game-breaking, but hey, what the hell do I know? Anyways, once this thing's burner cuts out, it's going to basically just start dropping right out of the air. It's not entirely bad news though, it does accelerate much faster than the AMRAAM, which makes it more dangerous up close, and while it may not look like it based on the stat card alone, it can actually pull a lot harder than the AMRAAM. This is because even though its max G-load is only 3 higher than the AMRAAM, it also has significantly more fin AOA, which means in layman's terms, its fins can turn further, thus allowing it to make more use of that G-load than the AMRAAM can. Its IR missiles, the PL-8Bs, on the other hand, are far from being substandard. Unlike the AIM-9Ms or R-73s, these missiles accelerate extremely fast right off the rails, giving nearby enemies almost zero time to react. And because it uses seeker shutoff IRCCM, it basically becomes impossible to spoof or shake off once it gets close to you. If launched from about 2.5 kilometers rear aspect, this thing is basically undodgeable, and from side aspect or against targets that are slow, hits from 4 or 5 kilometers are also possible. In fairness, it doesn't have thrust vectoring like the Mica or the R-73, so it still isn't the best dogfighting missile in the game necessarily, but overall, I think this is probably the best all-rounder we have currently. Until, of course, the Python 4, which is already in the game files, gets added and completely trounces everything we have. So, taking all these factors into account, what's the best way to play this aircraft? Well, it's still a flanker, so to be honest, there will be a lot of overlap with the Su-30SM strategy I laid out in that video, but with some very important distinctions. Starting off is pretty much the same. You still want to climb off the airfield at about a 35 to 45 degree angle away from the center of the map, climbing at around 5 degrees on full afterburner, and continuing to accelerate until you hit around 5,000 meters of altitude at Mach 1.3 to Mach 1.4. The first big difference has to do with high altitude BVR targets. Unlike the R-77-1 on the Su-30, the PL-12 just cannot reach AMRAAM sorts of ranges, even when launched high and fast, because that artificial drag nerf will just cause it to lose too much speed when the burner cuts out. 30 kilometers is about the absolute maximum range you'll be able to effectively deal with people at high altitude, but that's only against people who are just flying in a straight line and not really trying to fight the missile. In terms of its actual practical range, 20 kilometers is going to be about your absolute max, even at high altitude. Because of this range limitation, and because you don't carry that many missiles to begin with, my recommendation would be not to fire on any target unless they're within 15 kilometers and moving towards you at high speed. This goes for both targets below you and targets high up. I would also suggest employing a more reserved play style than the 30SM, where instead of circling in and trying to spam R-77s at the whole enemy team, I had more success using this aircraft to provide top cover, flying above the bulk of your team hugging the ground and firing on enemies who are closing in to attack them. While the PL-12 may not have the range of the AMRAAM, its very good pull and acceleration will still make it quite dangerous at these sorts of ranges, and once you run out of them, you still of course have your PL-8Bs. There are some nuances to using these sort of missiles effectively, so if you're unfamiliar, I would stick around for the entirety of this next part. Unlike seeker shutoff IRCCM missiles like the AIM-9M, which will follow the previous trajectory of the target, FOV IRCCM missiles shrink the size of the seeker head so that it only sees the target aircraft. The advantage of this is that if the FOV closes around the target aircraft at close range, it becomes almost impossible to spoof the missile. The downside is, at longer ranges, the FOV will not be small enough to fully blot out the enemy flares, so enemies who are pre-flaring will be essentially immune to these sorts of missiles unless you can get closer. There is actually a way to counter pre-flaring, but I'll get to that in a minute. So, to make the most out of these missiles, don't fire them at their theoretical maximum range unless you are certain the enemy doesn't see you. Otherwise, hold your fire until you're in the enemy's rear aspect and within 2.5 kilometers. Under these parameters, the PL-8B will be almost a guaranteed kill, especially if the enemy isn't paying attention, in which case they'll find a PL-8B shoved halfway up their ass before they even realize what's going on. And about pre-flaring, the best way to deal with this is actually your radar. I know it might sound a little counterintuitive to use your radar to guide an IR missile, but if you maintain a lock while firing on a target which is pre-flaring, the missile seeker head will stay locked on the target itself, thus cutting through their countermeasures. That's really all there is for missiles. In terms of flight performance in a dogfight, this thing is not fantastic. The Flanker's flight model bleeds a lot of speed at present and really doesn't retain its energy very well. It also lacks the thrust to just go UFO mode like a Mirage or a Eurofighter, so if you find yourself in a post-merge guns-only dogfight or something, you won't have the best time. Overall, though, the J-11B is a pretty solid aircraft. Though its missile loadout is a bit limited, its lower BR results in it having quite a favorable matchmaker most of the time, and it's also refreshing to have an IR missile which feels as powerful at top tier as the Magic 2 does down at the 12.0 BR range. It's still not exactly meta, and the limitations of the PL-12 are honestly pretty aggravating. However, I do expect that this missile will be unnerfed at some point, and when that happens, the J-11B will be quite potent at high altitude BVR. That's going to wrap it up for this one. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the playlist in the description for more content like this, and I'll see you guys the next one.